Thank you. So it sounds really pedantic, Gavin Anthony grounds, but it's only just to make sure that it differentiates me from my son, who's also Gavin grounds, so we're not that very imaginative when it comes to naming children. So I just make sure that I don't get his debt, basically. So Gavin grounds, I've been long-time partners with MetricStream over the years, so currently CEO and co-founder of Mercury Risk and Compliance. My background, just a little bit by way of introduction, so previously I was at Meta, and then before that Verizon, and then before that HP or Hewlett Packard Enterprise Services. So basically ran in each of those roles the cybersecurity strategy as well as the security risk and compliance programs. And at HP that was specifically the outsourcing business. So we didn't have to just care for one organization. We had to care for about 4,000 organizations across 60 plus countries, where we were responsible for the security risk and compliance of all of the IT and OT services that we deliver to those customers. So that's a little bit of background which will become relevant as we go through today's session. Grace, why don't you introduce yourself and I'll go through that.
That mic's working. So, hi, I'm Grace Beeson. I worked with Gavin at Hewlett Packard. So my background actually started as I was a clinical social worker for 20 years, did a massive job change. And then I worked with Gavin, and we'll talk a little bit about the things we did together in the past around that led to the risk quantification methodology that Gavin developed. And then Guidewire Software, was the director of GRC there, and I'm the co-founder now with Gavin for Mercury Risk and Compliance. You want to start?
Yeah, so
you could test.
We'll do Mike's first. All right, so just in terms of the agenda, what we want to do is, it's kind of cool that we've got a fairly tight room here, so let's make this interactive, so it doesn't have to be, an hour and 45 minutes of kind of listening and then asking questions later. So by all means, please dive in if you've got questions, if you have ideas, if you have any observations. But one of the things, in terms of the agenda, we want to talk a little bit about why quantification matters. And what we will also talk about specifically, what we do mean when we talk about risk quantification and what we do not mean. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that because that really is the foundation to making sure that whatever programs we put together are actually successful. Kind of related to that, we're going to dive into some of the models that, just briefly, that really focus on annualized loss expectancy. So, for example, if you're familiar with models like FAIR or things that are built around FAIR, you'll probably be aware that they are focused almost exclusively on annualized loss expectancy and single loss expectancy, and then trying to figure out some kind of calculation, if you like, around likelihood. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time digging into that and really explain why a model that's based exclusively on loss avoidance actually becomes unsuccessful in a cyber risk program. Then most importantly, and I guess what you're most interested in is then how. How do we build a meaningful business-centric risk quantification program that actually delivers value not only to the business, not only to the office of the CISO, but also to overall operations of the company as well. So we'll spend a fair bit of time on the how to, the show and tell. And then we'll kind of wrap up with some of the key takeaways that we would recommend in terms of how to build a successful program. And as I said, at the end we got to this fireside chat or Q&A, but by all means, let's make this interactive as we go. So, first of all, in terms of why we say that quantification is a prerequisite for success, we're probably all seeing this equation: risk is equal to likelihood multiplied by impact. Quick survey. There's no wrong answers to this question, by the way. Quick survey. Do you agree with that? So there's a few it's as good as any. So, and these are the kind of answers. Some people are like religious about it, like, yes, of course, that is the exact way we quantify risk. Others are like, well, it kind of depends, they also sort of put it right here. Well, it's good enough. If there's not any alternative. For me personally, I'm on the bottom row right there. Like, no, I disagree. And I will explain why. So first of all, is anybody familiar with this equation? That's okay, no, it's interactive. You're familiar with the equation?
Yeah.
You are? Okay. Anybody else familiar with it? It's the Euler-Lagrange equation. And what it's used for is calculating the optimum route between 2 points. So if you're starting from A and going to B, then you're looking to optimize what's the optimal route. Now you might think, well, a straight line is the optimal route. However, we're here on the harbour, so if we took our car and said we want to go into the city and we drove in a straight line, we're not going to be very successful. So all of us that use navigation and so on, is basically fundamentally built around the Euler-Lagrange equation. It's how to optimize the route, if you like, from point A to point B. And I'm emphasizing the word optimize because when it comes to risk management, that is what we need to do. We need to optimize risk. And that's why I mentioned earlier about, a loss avoidance program ultimately will fail us. Because in any other risk domain, we're not trying to reduce risk at all costs. What we're looking to do is see and decide what risk should we take and what risk will we not take. So if we have a program that's built exclusively around loss avoidance and trying to calculate annualized loss expectancy, then that's probably, if you've tried that, that's probably why you found some frustration, is because it's not answering all of the questions on how to optimize and manage risk. So just to, there we go. Did I just blind someone and push the wrong button? That was a laser button. If that blinded you, send the bill to Grace, and she'll sort it out. So, just to emphasize the point as to why we say this equation, this simple equation, really does not work. Particularly we talk about cyber risk, but we group that together with cyber, technology risk, IT risk, OT risk. They're all kind of kinfolk. They're all part of this kind of same family. So we're trying to do this as a mathematical equation. So first of all, these are just some of the contributing factors to likelihood. It's not all of them, but just some contributing factors. So for example, we might look at vulnerabilities and we have our, the CDSS score, or the CDE scores, right? And that might be a 0 through 10. And then we have a criticality, which is low, medium, high, critical. And then we have, let's see what other examples, architectural considerations. So when we think about exploitability, well, we could, from our vulnerability management system, we could get an exploitability score, but that's only looking at that actual specific vulnerability. For example, are there exploit kits available? Are those kits available online? Are they easy to use? Are they kiddie script kind of things? So that score, that exploitability score, is vulnerability centric. It's only focused on that vulnerability. What it does not take into consideration is where that shows up in your architecture. So for example, just raise your hand if you heard of this thing years ago called Log4j. Just pretty much everybody in the room. And if you think for most organizations when Log4j hit, what was the response? Well, the response was essentially all hands on deck. Go figure out where this Log4j is, get it out of the environment. Now what that did, by the way, from a financial perspective, is, first of all, did anybody here deal with Log4j in the room? Did you get to hire new engineers immediately on the spot to deal with it?
No.
So basically what that did, that approach, is it essentially, from a financial perspective, it diluted the net present value of every other initiative and every other program that was on. So in other words, let's say you had a bunch of engineers that focus on delivering a new product, and now you're redirecting their time to deal with Log4j. What we've done financially is diluted the net present value of that product that those engineers were developing. So there's therefore a negative financial impact because we're dealing with something that we didn't know exactly where it was in the environment. And let's say, I was at Verizon at the time, and so, we had considerations like, well, is that a circuit provisioning system? Or is it a system that manages the cafeteria menu? So, because the two are not equal in that sense in terms of the business value. So anyway, therefore we have architectural considerations. So where does this vulnerability show up in the environment? So we're probably going to pull that from Visio diagrams, or there's some Word documents somewhere, or some Google Docs, or whatever the case might be. But we can see where this equation is already starting to fall apart. Then we can look at things like user behavior. And so do we have high click rate users? Well, that's, again, it's a different metric. We're measuring click rates. Well, what role is that user in? And why does the click rate matter on this user versus that user? So again, a different denominator, if you like, from a mathematical perspective. And with third-party risk, maybe we're looking at, I have to be really careful where I pronounce this, bid size scores, for example. I don't usually pronounce it that way. But it's that outside-in view, but really what does that tell us? So we can say, well, we've got the bid size score, or we have our own internal analysts that have done a third-party risk assessment, and they've rated this vendor as a medium. So then, after all that, we can look at legal and regulatory exposure. So is this a particular platform or product, is it in scope for Sarbanes-Oxley? Is it in scope for NYDFS? Is it a payments platform and it's in scope for PCI? So the reason why I'm highlighting this is, when we say, well, how's that all related to likelihood? Well, if we have ineffective management of vulnerabilities, for example, there is a mathematical relationship between effective controls and likelihood of a problem happening in the first place. If something is in scope for a particular regulation scrutiny, then the more effective we are at managing our obligations and delivering against those citations, then likelihood is going to go down, the likelihood of us having some kind of regulatory failure. By the way, anyone who's spent time with Race 94, you'll know that we, in this model, we look at regulators as threat actors. It's true.
We actually get every time.
I said that with a bunch of regulators in the room one time, and I still got the same reaction in the end. Because when you think about the definition of a threat actor, it's really anything or any entity that can potentially impact our business operations. So clearly a cyber criminal can impact our business operations, but our failure to meet the requirements or citations of a regulation can equally impact our business operations. So even though it sounds a little bit jovial, it actually is correct. The only difference might be one's malicious and the other one is not supposed to be malicious. So then we talk about likelihood. So you've already seen now the challenge with this equation. Let's take a little look at, sorry, just to blind you, that's impact. So when we think about, if anyone's kind of worked around ALE type models, you're going to think about primary losses and secondary losses, like, hey, we're going to have fines, we have the cost of recovery, we have the cost of repair, we have lost revenue, we have lost potential revenue. By the way, somebody recently said it's impossible to calculate reputational risk. Just a side note, does anyone agree with that? So I've got some saying no, and some saying yes. So here's an interesting way to think about reputational risk, is the company cannot, I'm assuming it's a commercial organization, it's the same thing if it's any government organization, but using a commercial organization as an example, a company cannot lose more than its capital value. It cannot lose more than its market cap. So therefore, reputational damage can be measured. You can certainly measure what its maximum is, like what you absolutely go out of business, the company completely tanks. Well, that's measurable. So you can't lose more than your market cap, basically. So really, when we think of reputational risk or reputational impact, really the impact of the reputation is not an actual risk, or it's not a consequence, it's an outcome. So for example, there was a sports company that made footballs, soccer footballs. That kind of football, where you use your feet. So anyway, but this particular company, it wasn't a cyber thing, by the way, but they got some serious negative exposure because of where their soccer balls were being manufactured, and the fact that they were being manufactured, and it was children that were doing the hand stitching. So the reputational damage, that was the outcome. The risk was the actual consequence And the consequence was twofold. One is what revenue did they actually lose? That was the consequence. And also if they had to pay particular fines. So the reputational damage wasn't the risk, that was simply their outcome. And it's an important one when we talk about some of the key takeaways, something that Grace and I have been kind of philosophized, if you like, and proven out, is that when we talk about risk management, if you take the word risk and replace the word risk with consequence, does the sentence still make sense? And if it does, then that's a risk statement. If it doesn't, then it's not a risk statement. And I'll give you an example. I was in one of the companies in my history. I was in a room with a bunch of lawyers. Any lawyers in the room, by the way? Okay, good. And we were having a conversation. It was about cyber-related risks. And one of the comments that one of the gentlemen made was, well, that's going to increase the risk. And I said, no, it's not. It will change the likelihood. So it's not a play on words when you think about it. Sometimes we use the word risk, and what we're really saying is we're talking about likelihood. So increasing the risk, if you say, well, if the risk is a consequence, does the consequence change? Well, in that particular example, the consequence didn't change, or the potential consequence. What changed was the likelihood. And so again, when we think about this calculation, first of all, excuse me, we think of risk as being the consequence. So is the consequence really likelihood times impact? And the answer clearly is no. And now, after this session, I think we have a cocktail session, is that right, Mike? So, if anyone can solve this equation at the bottom, I'll buy the drinks tonight. But you see the point's it basically makes the point for itself. So with all the different denominators that we have around controls and the way we measure controls and the way we measure effectiveness of controls, and all the different metrics and ways in which we describe attack surface and architectural considerations, the denominator is different in every single one of them. So we can't take a median multiplied by 10 divided by, most likely. It's mathematically not possible to solve the equation. So that's why I said earlier, that's why I do not believe that risk or consequence is a simple multiplication of likelihood times impact. And that's why I put a massive cross through right there on the slide. So I'll kind of leave to Mike. Is this information available to the attendees after the sessions as well? Okay, cool. So just kind of doubling down on this idea that a risk is essentially a potential consequence. So again, I'm using the example here is to say that there's no such thing as data loss risk. Now, you might say, well, of course there is. When we think about risk in the English language, risk is a verb as well as a noun. So when we think about data loss, and we're taking that idea that the risk is translating to a consequence, then a data loss event, the loss is the outcome. Either somebody got access to data that they shouldn't have access to, or there was a breach and data was lifted out, or it was accidentally sent to the wrong party. But that data loss, that's the outcome, that's the resulting state. The risk or the consequence answers this question. So what? So I don't know, there's a particular software that I use on my machine, and it annoys me because sometimes its job is to protect me in a cybersecurity way. And sometimes I think it's just trying to sell me stuff. And it will pop up occasionally and say, your email address appeared in 3 different sites in the dark web. They're also trying to sell me something. And it's probably true. But my first reaction is, so what? If now your social security number is showing up for sale on the dark web, the answer to so what is a different answer. Then I might decide that I want to take some preemptive steps to protect my actual identity. So again, that data loss, the data loss is just the outcome. The risk is what the corresponding consequence might be, or consequences, plural, because of the data loss. All right, how to go about it. Well, first of all, and Grace, I'm going to transition to you in a few minutes if you don't mind. So first of all, why do we say that if you focus exclusively on an annualized loss expectancy model, why that will cause our cybersecurity and technology risk program to fail? And there's a couple of reasons for it. First of all, most of those models are scenario-based. And the scenario-based, and even the whole approach of single loss expectancy and annualized loss expectancy and frequency calculations and likelihood being thrown in there, they all actually come out of a completely different risk domain. So particularly like insurance, for example. So in Austin, as you can tell by my accent, from Austin, Texas, and so I live in Austin, is downtown. So about 3 blocks away from Lady Bird Lake, which is part of the Colorado River. And it's a high-rise, so we're on the 23rd story. So when I think about risk in a traditional way, then I have a finite number of perils that could impact my home, my unit. Fire, theft, flood, earthquake. And no, it sounds weird, but we actually did have a tremor in Austin, Texas a month or 2 ago. But the point being is I can literally count, if not on one hand, certainly on 2 hands, the number of perils that my unit could potentially be exposed to. So let's pick one of them. We'll pick flood. So 3 blocks from Lady Bird Lake, and we've got a whole history of how many times the lake has burst its banks, and usually what time of year. However, if the lake bursts its banks to the 23rd story, I think we've got a slightly different problem. That's like the Ice Age or something. So I've got probably less to worry about than the rest of the nation. So the point being though, that as I start thinking about scenarios, well, what could with my unit? Well, maybe I do some terrible DIY, do it yourself. Maybe I leave an attack on him. Or maybe the neighbor does. Or maybe, and this did happen by the way, there was poor workmanship in the main pipe in the riser, and it actually burst on our floor. So from the 23rd floor down, got flooded. By the way, almost 9 months later, it was all repaired. I went in to sign off on the sign-off sheet on the Thursday. Friday morning, this is absolutely true, I got a phone call saying, yeah, there's been a leak detected, and your unit's been impacted. So what's the likelihood of that? Anyway, the point being is that there's still a finite number of scenarios, and there's a finite number of perils that can affect my unit. And so, yeah, I could calculate an annualized loss expectancy, single loss expectancy, likelihood of what got wrong, but still. But when you think of it in the cyber world and in the IT world and the tech world, we actually have an infinite number of perils. Like the perils are just increasing. There's the obsession with AI right now, and now we're even imagining and trying to fantasize about what the perils might be in the future because of AI and the way it's being adopted today. So at least we have an ever-increasing number of perils, but from a scenario perspective, we have an absolutely infinite number of possible scenarios. So how can we sit there and have a serious conversation with ourselves about trying to come up with scenarios of what might happen, and if that happens, then how likely is that, and then what's the impact going to be? Now, how do we sit there in the room and have that serious conversation with ourselves? Raise your hand if you've been around the table having that kind of conversation. If you work with an ISO auditor, they're going to go, oh, so what's your top risks? And you list them once a year, and then they'll either say, what's a short list? Or how many should it be? I don't know, but more than that. So the point being is that the reality is there's an infinite number of scenarios. So that's why if we're locked in on exclusively focused on trying to calculate annualized loss expectancy, our program is not going to deliver the value that we're looking for. The second thing, by the way, on likelihood is You're probably familiar with some of the models that use Monte Carlo simulations. So a Monte Carlo simulation, if you're not familiar with it, it's basically a mathematical regression model. And it starts off with the principle says all things being equal, then if you repeat the same process over and over and over, you get a distribution curve, which is your likelihood curve. But the key to that is all things being equal. And it's called Monte Carlo simulation for a reason. Monte Carlo is the city of chance in Monaco. No, it's there equivalent of Las Vegas, basically. So when you think about like a roulette wheel, well then, you could use a regression model on a roulette wheel, provided all things are equal. So it has to be the same table, the same day, the same temperature, the same wheel, the same spinner, the same ball. In cyber, we're not dealing with an unintelligent roulette wheel. We're dealing with an intelligent threat actor. A threat actor that will react and change their game with every move that we make, or that we don't make. So if you did want to liken it to a casino game, it'd be more like Texas Hold'em, like poker. Every card I play is going to change your game. If I choose not to play, changes your game. If I choose to hold or fold, changes your game. We're working with intelligent threat actors. And dare I say, even with regulators, as intelligent threat actors. Is that being recorded? So therefore, loss considerations are important factors to consider, but they should not be the exclusive factor. And that's certainly what we've kind of learned over the years is when we focus, instead of just exclusively on loss avoidance, but really on value protection, then that's how we can actually build an effective quantification model. So let's see, Grace, do you want to take the mic a little bit?
Sure. I think this one's working, so I'm still going to see if we can get it. All right, so Bob said. So how does this is the model that we're building. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you build that and what you do with it. So what does all that mean? And by the way, the scenario Gary was talking about with the auditor, with the scenario assessment. So that's one of my pet peeves is that risk assessment we do every year, where we all sit on the table and we fantasize about what it is that we think our risks are, and then maybe a month or two later, I mean, I don't know, for myself, I second guess myself. Like, why did I think that was critical? Maybe that's a high. Like, what was on my mind that day, or why did we do that? We don't know. So that's one of the problems when you're looking at things from qualitative. And I've had that conversation actually with a number of my auditors. So they come in, especially the ISO auditors love that annual assessment. They come in, they ask for our annual risk assessment. And I give it to them reluctantly, and then I give them a lecture about why it's worthless, because I can't help myself. And then we talk about how we actually do risk on a continual basis. So risk for me is bi-directional. Risk is informed by my issues, and risk is also will inform my issues. For me, it's things like my day-to-day activity. What are we doing? What am I doing about the controls that I have in my environment? What am I doing about the things that we have going on with our audits, with my customers, with my just general health and safety, health and wellness of my the security overall? So this model that we have, so Gavin was talking a little bit earlier about your Log4j. And you look at Log4j, and he mentioned it, but I'm going to go back to that in a minute. I'm going to go back to it now, actually. When you're thinking about things like Log4j, the decisions that we made on how we prioritize where we were going to direct our resources and our staff were based on some speculative and value that we had on the assets that it was affecting. So the model we have, we've got two scores you can get. So the first one is this asset value ratio score. Now, asset value for us is not a financial value only. Finance is in there. So we definitely look at, and I'm sorry, let me back up. A value for us, for this model, is a thing of, an asset rather for us is a thing of value. It's not a server. It's not a blade or any of that. Those are subcomponents of our assets. An asset is, it can be your product suite, it can be information, it can be processes. So anything that is of value within the organization, that's what we're looking at as assets. So the first thing we do is we want to look at the things that contribute to value of those assets. So things are finances, right? So obviously, let's say it's your product suite. That'll be an easy one. your product suite. Obviously, if it's revenue generating or if you have a loss potential, there's some financial impact there. But we also have that regulatory scrutiny we were talking about. You've got auditors coming in. So if you're looking at, I mean, think about this, for those of you who are in an environment that's like a Sarbanes-Oxley environment, when you're doing your user access reviews, for example, you definitely are looking at those environments where you have finances and where you're impacted by your SOX, or where those products are going to be impacted by your SOX, right? So we're looking at things like, or you have a PCI environment. You're going to pay attention to the controls that you put in those environments that are going to be governed by your PCI audit, because if you don't have those controls in place, you have the potential of failing your audit. We look at things like your architectural design. How many APIs do you have? Are they bidirectional APIs? Are they going in one direction or the other? How many users do you have in that environment? The more users you have, the more points of egress that you potentially have. The business value, mission criticality and strategic directionality. So you're not just looking at the finances, but you're looking at strategic. So think about if you're in a product environment, think about whatever services you're providing to your customers, you have your latest product. Well, your customers are likely not all on that latest version, right? They're going to be on a previous version probably, and then migrating up to the newest one. So from a current revenue generation, that newest release may not be making much revenue at all. So if you only focus on the financial aspect of it, you're not looking at the relative value of that asset that is your strategic, mission critical, strategic directionally asset. So you're maybe moving everybody to that. You want to make sure that that environment is, or that product, that asset is being secured properly. So we're going to look at the values. What we do with that is, and then the other thing that Gavin talked about earlier, he showed you those mathematics. He likes to talk about the mathematics. I'm not the math whiz, he is. So, but when you look at the things that are going into that, look at the list that I have on this left. Revenue generation is going to be in some kind of finance, whether it's dollars or euros or yen or whatever it is. Your VIA is going to be usually critical, medium, high, low. Your internet facing, is it internet facing? That's going to be a yes, no answer. And then you have your regulatory environment, for example. We also have in here, by the way, we also have some user risks. We have some user functionality, the geographic location that your users are in. So again, that's going to contribute to the relative value. So when you look at this list together and you look at that formula Gavin had up a few minutes ago, how are you going to do any kind of calculation on that? We can't. So what we've done is we take all those things and we normalize that data. And so we're going to translate it. The system the program that Gavin designed and that we're working on together now at Mercury, we've converted all of that into a point system. So it's an empirical point system. Think about it like airline miles. And so what you end up with on your asset value risk score is a relative score comparing one asset to the other, and then we stack rank them. So you can see in a relative score number that asset 456 is the most important relative to other assets within your environment, your enterprise. Then we go to addressable risk. Well, addressable risk is fundamentally your control effectiveness. So we look at a whole bunch of things. We've got I'm at 600 now. And about 600 elements that contribute to that score. The asset value risk score, by the way, we've got about 125 or so elements that go into that. And so the addressable risk score, we're going to look at things. So a lot of models that are looking at quantitative risk management focus on vulnerabilities. Oftentimes when you're looking at quantitative risk management models, they're focusing on your scores related to your vulnerabilities. And those are absolutely a very large part of the scoring that we do. However, we have other scores as well. The fact that, we talked about the regulatory environment, so I'll go back to that. The fact that you've got an open audit issue and you've got an auditor coming in a month and you haven't addressed that issue, depending on the audit, if you have a repeat finding, they may bump that up. So like in an ISO audit, for example, if you have a minor non-conformance and that auditor comes back and you haven't done anything with that and you had agreed to that finding and you had said you're going to fix that, it's likely that you could end up with a major nonconformance the next year. So there's a risk related to the outcome, as we like to say it, of not passing that audit or having a problem. PCI, the same thing. If you haven't done your quarterly reviews and your audit's coming up, you have the potential of not passing that audit. So we incorporate all of those things as well. We look at a variety of different controls, and then again, when you look at those, you're going to get yes/no answers, you're going to get critical, medium, highs, you're going to get number values, and we're normalizing all of that also into an empirical score. So we end up with, at the end of all this, we're going to show you how this works a little bit more. You'll end up with two different scores. So you have your asset value score, how important is that asset relative to other assets, and then I'm going to have an addressable score. And that's basically how effective are my controls. The more important your asset, the lower you want your addressable score to be. So I want to have a low number fundamentally saying that my controls are working and they're effective. And then getting back to the likelihood, the higher the value of your asset, the higher your addressable score, the more likely you're going to have a negative impact if you're impacted by some kind of exploit. You can click up there. All right, you want to talk about Adam?
Sure.
How do we do that?
So just to kind of just recap just a little bit. So the essence of this, I just want to repeat something that Grace said, is it's a points-based system. And Grace mentioned something like collecting air miles. You know, so the more segments you fly, the more points you earn. The more you spend on your credit card associated with your account, if you've got one of those, the more points you earn. So it's not a 1 through 100 or 1 through 10. It's as many points as you can possibly earn. So what we're really doing with this model is we're taking all these disparate kinds of information, whether it's your architecture, for example. What we're really describing there is your attack surface. You know, the more API connections you have, if they're external API connections, if it's internet facing, if it's connected to a third party, that's all attack surface in cyberspeak. What we're doing is we're converting the attack surface essentially into a numerical representation of that attack surface. So the bigger the number, the bigger the surface. The same with regulatory scrutiny. The more regulations that your asset is exposed to or under scrutiny from, then you're going to get more points added. So that's the regulatory attack surface, you might say, of your regulatory scrutiny. And by doing it this way, what it does is literally then allows us to solve it as a mathematical problem. But to Grace's point earlier, is we're solving for what you care about the most. We're just going to show you exactly how this is done. But basically, that kind of left-hand side, the higher the number of points at the end of that, we know what's at the very top. It's not going to be that system that's in the cafeteria running the cafeteria system. That is going to be, for example, a trading asset, trading platform, or it's going to be a manufacturing control system. And so the one with the highest score is the one we care about the most. And then to Grace's point, the right-hand side, similar kind of concepts where we're adding points based on how ineffective a control is. So as an example, if it's supposed to be subscribed to MFA and it's not using MFA, then we'll earn points because it's not associated with MFA. If it's supposed to have single sign-on and it doesn't, we add points. So getting points on the right-hand side is a bad thing. But what it allows us to do is using the points from the asset value, allows us to stack rank, as Grace explained it. And then based on that, we can set the budget. So we talk about risk appetite. Recently, by the way, at different conferences, one of the questions we asked, how do you explain to your business partner how to set aside cybersecurity risk appetite? They said you don't. What we do is we help them to understand their most valuable assets and how well we are or are not protecting those assets from a cyber and technical perspective. So what this allows us to do is give not only a cyber risk view, but also a regulatory risk view associated with that as well, or a controls-based risk view. So, just getting back to any questions on the model, by the way, so far? I know we've done a lot of kind of talking. Please, yeah.
Yes, let's say Bloomberg, for example. Do you have your own predefined score, or do you rely on the enterprise score for rating Bloomberg?
Okay, so the question was, using Bloomberg as an example, do we have our own score, for example, or would we use something like a Bloomberg score? So let's just go back to, so on the top there, we say the business value. That's for a particular asset, for example. Let's say we're looking at third parties, which we do look at, and we apply this model not only to the third party organization, but to the actual products that are being used from that organization. So I'll give a very specific example. Let's say one of your products is software. You know, maybe you're selling software or SaaS or whatever the case might be, and you might be using a specific library from Adobe. So, you know, the BitSight score, or even the Bloomberg score, or the DNB score, Dun & Bradstreet, for you is kind of interest. But what you're more interested in is, what about the library itself that we're consuming, and where are we using that library in our product set? So what this model does is it actually does both. So if, for example, if you're using Bloomberg scores, and the asset is associated with a third party for which you have a Bloomberg score, then that would be one of the bullet points there. So this is not an exhaustive list. It's great that there's about 600 or so elements that this model can feed from. If it's not Bloomberg, let's say it could be Dun & Bradstreet, it could be pretty much any third party, if you like, scoring systems. Does that answer your question? Yes, please.
I have a question regarding the comment you guys made about normalizing the scores. So are you going to normalize each factor, and then each normalized score becomes an attribute which gets added, and that's where you get the score per application? Is that how you're doing it?
It is, yeah. So I'll just repeat the question. So the question was basically, when we talk about normalizing, are we essentially assigning a numerical representation for each value? And the answer is yes. And then we build a cumulative on that. So, let's say that one of the questions could be, is it in scope for PCI? Well, that's a kind of yes/no. Either yes it is or no it's not. Yeah. If it's yes, then we'll give a numerical representation, 1. If it's no, it gets a 0. Now, with the model, what we apply is, and also I won't go into all of the IP, but basically, conceptually, what we apply is coefficients through some balancing. So, so therefore, is it in scope for PCI? Yes equals 1. Yeah. How many vulnerabilities does it have in the environment? 10,000. So is 10,000 now more important than 1? And so what we use is coefficients to balance that out, so we don't end up, just literally taking all these points and then just add them all together. We use coefficients so that you can essentially say which element or which characteristic is more important than another element or another characteristic.
I think what threw me off was you were talking about kind of the airline miles analogy, which is kind of unlimited on the upside, right? So when you're doing the normalizing kind of approach to it, you have a lower and upper bound per attribute, right? And then when you're adding the coefficients, there is a mathematical max score that you can get. It's not kind of the upper end is not infinite.
Okay, so again, just to repeat the question. So the question was essentially, are we applying a low and a max to it, or is it truly potentially infinite? The answer is it actually is truly potentially infinite. So when Grace talked earlier about stack ranking, let's say when we've applied all of the mathematics to this left-hand side on the asset value risk, within your portfolio, whatever that portfolio of assets is, one of them is going to be the top of the pile, and then one of them is going to be at the bottom of the pile. So then the relativity becomes basically your environment. So we're not trying to say, well, the top score is 100, the bottom score is 1. So we're not kind of doing a GPA, if you like, on it. What we're really doing, it truly is potentially an infinite number. But what's consistent is the interpretation. So for every element that we interpret into a numerical representation, that interpretation is consistent across the board, which then does allow you within your portfolio to actually see the relativity, if you like, from one asset to another.
The other thing on that is that I talked earlier and I said, twice. The number of elements we have, so we have about 125 or so going into the asset value, about 600 going into the addressable. Almost no time when we start doing this with somebody or implementing with somebody, Almost never, well, in fact, never, have we gone to the point where the first rendition of that is 125 elements, or whatever the actual number is for asset value, and 600. We start with smaller numbers. So those numbers will grow. Your score will grow because you're adding the elements in. So if we start with like maybe 20 elements, your number's going to be smaller, but they're relative. So their consistency across your environment and the different assets that we're scoring, because they're all being scored with similar types of elements. Right, so if you only have access to about 20 of those elements first, then we'll score 20 elements. And then with the relative score of the asset value. Same thing with the addressable, is we find that often vulnerability information is usually pretty readily available. Issues management, we're going to talk a little about this later, we are actually integrating with, or actually pulling information on MetricStream. So that's why we're here, right? We're at the MetricStream conference because we are using the issues management. We can do it with MetricStream or other GRC platforms as well, but we're pulling that information out, and typically it's easier. We've used MetricStream, so it's very easy to pull that number out for your issues. Finances, on the other hand, sometimes when we're working with customers, we find that depending on the environment, even sometimes the CISO has a hard time getting to some of that finances. So usually those are a little bit harder to dig into. They're a little bit more protected, or some of the contract information is a little bit more protected. And so we phase all of that information, and we'll look at what information is easily accessible, readily accessible, and easily consumable. You can pull it in, we can either do a direct API connection, or you can pull it through a CSV, or some kind of Excel, or Google Sheets, or whatever, and we can get that information. The information that's on a PowerPoint or a Word document, or that you've got to have more permissions and people a little bit more protective, we put that in as a phase 2. So as we add information and elements, your score is actually just going to grow larger. A lot of people will think that, like, oh, but you still must be scoring it on the 1 to 10. We don't. We really don't. It really is like 1 to infinity. We're going to show you some examples in that. In fact, we can get into our live environment. We're going to show you how it actually works and with the number. You'll see what some of the numbers look like.
When you're stack ranking, how do you cater for things that have high blast radius but effectively does not tick a lot of the boxes? So I'll give you an example of this. DNS will score high on BIA, but will score nothing on revenue, nothing on mission criticality, nothing on strategic direction, nothing on GDPR, nothing on PCI. You can go down the list. You'll get almost 0 on the rest of the asset classes. But if DNS was the one and only vulnerable item on your network, it is going to take down the organization. So how do you cater for that?
Yeah, so I'll briefly repeat the question. So the question was essentially, what if it's a service like DNS, where DNS is essentially the asset in this model? What the gentleman was saying is that there's no revenue considerations with DNS and so on and so forth. But what there is mission criticality. So DNS will learn itself point to mission criticality for the exact reason you just said. It's like if DNS goes away, or it could be your Active Directory, if you're depending on Active Directory in your environment, then your mission criticality score for Active Directory would be much higher. And then you recall that I mentioned earlier about coefficients. So you can apply the coefficients, in other words, which element is more important than the other. You can do that at the enterprise level, but you can also do it at the specific asset level. So for example, then you could use the coefficient to make sure that for DNS, for example, that the coefficient that's applied to mission criticality for DNS ensures that the score is balanced, so it shows them sufficiently at the right level, if you like, of the actual asset stack. Does that make sense?
It does and doesn't, because I think if you take DNS, let's say you're an online shop. So you take DNS versus your payment portal, Shopify or something like that. That would overtake. So let's say your Shopify button would have revenue generation. It will also be mission critical. It will also be BIA critical. It will also have internet facing. So it will tick a lot more boxes. But in terms of a blast radius, in terms of if it went ahead, how much would you lose? How long is your downtime? What's your exposure? The Shopify button is potentially less exposure than DNS. I'm just using this as a straw man argument.
But with DNS just inherent the criticality from Shopify or some other revenue-generating system, because if you lose it, you lose that.
That's the problem. In this model, there's no, if we take the, let's say, traditional model, you take DNS and sort of put it on its own space and say it has all this impact and therefore I'm pushing it up. So I'm trying to understand how would I do that? Because in this model, there's a stacking model, all the other factors are zeroed out. So I need to somehow, and if I were to put a manual attestation, then I don't know what else it will impact downstream.
Yeah, so that's difficult to summarize the whole question, but if you didn't quite catch it, so the general conversation there was about, DNS would show up and say, well, it's critical if DNS isn't working, but what if you're running an online store? It was the example you gave, and you got your Shopify service, or whatever products you're using to manage the checkout. Well, the gentleman was saying that, well, that would earn points for revenue and so on and so forth. But two things one that I didn't share yet, and I'll share that right now, is that with this model, and we didn't want to go into excruciating detail, with this model there is an interdependency aspect as well. So you can have two assets, and if they're interdependent or codependent, there's scoring associated with that as well. So that's one of the ways we address the concern that you've raised. And the other is again, that those coefficients can be applied at this specific asset level. So back to that's why we spent a fair bit of time at the beginning of the conversation to really lay the foundation and say, risk is really consequence management. So in the example you just gave, what's the consequence if DNS is not functioning? Well, the consequence is you're not generating revenue. What's the consequence if your shopping cart checkout is not working? Well, the consequence is you're not generating revenue. So because it's a consequence-based model, and the likelihood is associated with, as Grace mentioned earlier, the effectiveness of your controls. The more effective controls, like architecturally, is there a failover? Is it a hot failover? All those kind of architectural considerations. The more effective your controls, then your addressable score is going to be lower. If you're missing controls and the controls are not effective, your addressable score is going to be higher. So therefore, the way this model would work is the interdependency, for example, with DNS and your revenue streams would show up on the left-hand side, which would elevate its score and put it higher in your portfolio, which means that you would set a target of a lower tolerance for addressable risk scores. So in other words, the less effective your controls, the more points get added over this side. So you set the target. So you might have your Shopify and your DNS, they might have different targets, but the targets are set and associated with the value, and the higher the value, the lower the target. And Grace will actually walk through and show you exactly what that kind of looks like to essentially address that kind of scenario. Okay. All right, so one of the questions or comments that we've been given around this model is people say, well, we don't have a good CMDB. Does anybody here have a good CMDB? I don't mean the vendor, I mean just the content. I've joke and say, my yet to be conceived grandchildren will all retire and still nobody will have a good CMDB. Even AI won't have a good CMDB. So the reason why I'm pointing that out is the question that we often ask, well, as Grace mentioned, we've got 600 or so elements that we can measure. We do not need 600 elements to actually make this work. We take the principle of, well, I've said it a few times, start with what you do know, improve based on what you could know, and aspire to what you should know. And we'll show that that little caption, because that really does make sense. Is literally, you start with what you could know. So what we've done is we've made the assumption that no one's ever going to have a decent CMDB. If they've got one, then that will be a source of information. But we'll always view that as an untrusted source, even though it's supposed to be a trusted source, because it's only as current as it's current. So what we've built out is this thing called dynamic asset mapping. not asset management, it's dynamic asset mapping. And we thought that was really cool until we thought about the acronym. And then we thought, no, it's probably not. We should put the word automatic in front of it, and then it's Adam. So basically what we do is, I mentioned earlier, my previous life role, so I was essentially the CISO of the enterprise services delivery of HP, all the IT outsourcing. And so, unfortunately, one of my functions, one of my roles was dealing with cyber investigations and so on. So essentially what we've done is codified everything that you would do during an investigation, even though there's no event to investigate. And so essentially from all potential sources of information, let's say for example, like actually Grace gave the example earlier, when we talk about financial value, for example, we had one client who, even the CISO didn't have access to that kind of information. So he said, okay, so you've got 15 or so products, because they wanted to focus it initially on their product suite, so really focus on revenue. But he didn't have direct access to, but they were using Salesforce. So what he did have access to, though, was a range. So he said, if this is a tier 1 product, it means it's generating between X and Y euros per month. And they have tier 2 and tier 3. So we just use that data. So okay, well, give us that data, give us that table. We had another client where we could get all the information out of Salesforce. So not only could we see the distribution, if like, of revenue associated with each particular product, but we could also see future value as well. So what was in the pipeline, what sales qualified leads, and so signed contracts and contract commencement dates and contract renewal dates. So we were able to mine all of that information to help us to actually score and produce the score from the current and future fiscal value. Now what's really cool about this model, by the way, is it becomes indisputable. So unlike I said earlier, those conversations where we sit around the table and we talk about scenarios that might happen, that's all disputable. In fact, one of the companies in my previous life, I remember the very first meeting I went into like that with internal audit, and I was looking down this list and I was like, did this stuff happen? I'm like, no, we just go around the table and talk about things that could happen. What's really cool with this model is we take the opinion out of the room almost. Because what we're really doing now is just say, well, that's the answer. If you don't like the answer, then either your data is wrong or you're wrong, because it's your data. And so, I don't want to say arguments to a customer like that, but it's like an internal conversation. But it really does make it, but then it becomes more trustworthy. So, configuration management, I'll give you an example on that. So we've got one customer where we're literally ingesting about 250,000 records that represent their entire AWS and Azure configurations. So what we're able to do from that is literally mathematically score the overall attack surface, at least it's associated with their cloud environment. Then they have config management, and if you're using AWS, for example, MetricStream in the partnership with the audit manager, is it? So all that kind of data. We had another environment where they were more of a Broadcom shop, and so for managing configuration of particular legacy environments, we could capture configuration, either configuration drift or there was no drift. But what we found, I'll give you an example, would be there was a particular security profile that was applied to a container, but because of the data we had, we were able to map the fact that that container was associated with a PCI environment, or it was in scope of PCI. So even though there was a security policy applied to that container, it was the wrong policy, given that it was supposed to be compliant with PCI requirements. So there's all kinds of things with this model that we can literally use the data and essentially do an investigation. I'll give you another example. One customer, I think they have 14 different products. And within the environment, those products were referred to in at least 1,500 different ways. So with this model, what I mean by that, it could be the naming convention of a particular of containers, or naming convention of virtual machines, or naming conventions of data sets. So it could be that this product is Mickey Mouse. Over here it's referred to as MM-XYZ. And so with the intelligence that we built into this, it actually does that discovery and starts to learn. That says, okay, whenever I see something that looks like this, it's probably the Mickey Mouse product. Or it's associated with, I don't mean Mickey Mouse as a stupid product, I mean, just arbitrarily. It's not Disney, by the way, so Disney. What's really cool is then when we, like for example, is anybody using like network discovery tools, where you scan your network and you get a list of, what was one of the most frustrating things about the results of network discovery? It changed everything. Yeah, everything got changed. Yeah, so you got duplicates, a lot of change, and so you're left with really more questions than answers, fundamentally. So it could be like, well, okay, this IP address, but probably wasn't the same IP address as it had last time around. So we've got this IP address, we've figured out it's a virtual machine, we've figured out it's running a version of Windows or Linux or whatever, and the next question is, well, what's it doing? And that can sometimes be the hard question to answer. What this approach does, it helps to answer that question. We had one, for example, where we were pulling in from Jira, so they were using Jira for a lot of workflow. And literally in one of the fields from Jira, it said, hey John, what do you think about blah, 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 blah? So that was one of the fields. So because we had access to all this other data, we were able, through code, so we were able to ascertain that contextually, John was therefore the CFO of this organization, and therefore the application or the question that was being raised was to the CFO, so this has probably got some kind of financial / Sarbanes-Oxley implications to it, and then using the rest of the data sets, we're able to establish it's that container. Oh, by the way, that network scan that was run, that's those 3 new devices, or apparently new devices, that are associated with this. And so what it does is it allows you then to, and this is one of the biggest hurdles, I think, that we've certainly found when we take this approach, is how do you map the actual IT component or the OT component, how do you map that to the thing of value, the asset? And this is how we do it. So you really think about it as an automated cyber investigation BI on steroids. That's kind of what it does. But we're using it so that we can understand and contextualize the IT and OT environments as it pertains to business value. Any questions on that, apart from, well, that's why it's called Adam. Speaking of AI, by the way, that image in the background, AI did that for us. So, and there it's cool. So, Rich, you want to take over? Thank you. Show us how to
Yeah, you want to
We're not saying don't go on stage with kids on computers. So we'll see how we can use that.
You want to get into that?
Yes. Oh, this one first. Okay, sorry.
Skipped ahead on me. Okay, so the other thing that we do is we'll show you what it looks like and how the scoring looks in a minute. We also have this concept that we started, and we developed this together at Hewlett Packard many years ago, which is automated controls efficacy testing. Fundamentally, what we're doing is we're looking at, most of our companies have, I don't know, tens or hundreds of different products running for security and our security suites, and maybe not hundreds, but we certainly have tens, 10, 20, 30 different products running that are collecting data, but they're not talking to each other. So we've got pockets of information all over the place, and you have swivel chair processes and you, maybe if you're in GRC, and I'm gonna assume that, how many people in this room are like in some kind of GRC kind of role? I'm assuming you're MetricStream, right? So you're in that role, how much access do you have to that information? So other than if you're accountable for third-party audit, you're probably having a hard time pulling all that information. Somebody else is taking care of vulnerability management. Somebody else is looking at like your gas and your SAS scans. But what we're doing is we're pulling all that information together through automation. And we can do that in a couple of different ways. We can do direct API connections. So we built that a number of years ago. Back at Hewlett Packard, it's one of the first things Gavin and I were doing together, and we needed to scale. And I needed to be able to, I was running the GRC globally at Hewlett Packard, and I needed, Gavin was my boss at the time, and I needed to be able to do that for more customers. We had about 5,000 customers in about 70 different countries, and I had 150 staff. And that sounds like a lot, and it was but it was a massive organization. It was 150 out of over 100,000 staff. So when you look at it that perspective, it was a small number. We had about 500,000 servers, and then with all of the other jump servers and all the virtual machines and all of that, we had almost 1 million environments. So 150 people went, and they weren't all doing that. About 60 or 70 of my engineers, my team rather, were engineers focused on our infrastructure compliance tool. And then I had my GRC platform running, and I had a manual process running to do controls testing. And so what I did is we were looking at this, and I had a group of people over here that were running automation on my servers, and we were doing about 250,000 of our 500,000 servers every month rather. We were scanning those, it was coming up with the results, and I knew the compliance for about 200 or so controls that we were able to do with controls test automation. And then my other GRC, my pure GRC team was managing this manual process. Well, it was coming out of the GRC platform, but it was a manual process that would go out to a control owner, ask them if they were compliant with a particular control. They would answer yes or no, and then they'd have to provide evidence. And a lot of times what we were finding is that evidence was coming from the other product. So Gavin said to me, we need to do that more. I was doing it at the time I had modularized the program, and so we were doing it we had a concept of key controls. So key controls was basically your basic health and safety, health and security rather, of your environment. So again, I told you we had about 5,000 staff, customers rather. We were not doing that on 5,000 customers because I relied on the delivery staff to be able to answer a lot of those questions as the control owners. Guess what? I got a lot of complaints, and it was audit fatigue. You're constantly auditing us. The third-party auditors are in, the SOC audit's here, the Sarbanes-Oxley audit's here, the ISO audit's here, and now you want to do this too. I don't have time for this. But then I also had them looking at this report that was coming out, that was generated. So I asked my team, I'm like, can you make these things, they were both looking at the same controls. And our controls were all in our GRC platform. I said, can't these things talk to each other? Now, Gavin likes to joke and say, again, I told you that I started as a clinical social worker. I do not have an engineering background. I came into this through HIPAA and through compliance, and my background is mostly compliance. And he likes to joke and say that I did that not knowing what an API was. I didn't, he's right, but my team did. And so very quickly we were able to build that through an API. Well, that was one product that we were looking at. I thought, well, if we can do that within one product, can't we do that with more? And so fundamentally what we did is we looked at how we had automation within the tool. So think about the different modules, and I don't know, think about the modules you're using, like in MetricStream. Are you using policy and document and IT risk management, IT compliance? If you're using all of those things, they can talk to each other. And so you can do things like, if you're, the audit, let's say you're doing controls effectiveness and the controls module. If you're looking at that and you go through the process, and let's say you're going to do that manual, I'll talk about the external automation in a second. Let's just talk about the internal automation. So let's say you're doing that and you come up to a point and you say, well, no, we're not compliant with that control. And there's agreement. Maybe your GRC team is going to work with your control owners and say, but do you do something like that that'll meet the intent of the standard? And you come up and say, we just decided no, we didn't do it. Well, I don't want my team to slowly have to go into issues management and not open an issue. That doesn't make any sense. It's a loss of efficiency. And my concern is not only is it inefficient, but things happen during the day. That person gets well, I would say a phone call, but then I was going to date myself if I did that. Nobody gets a phone call anymore. Somebody gets a Slack message, or they get a text. Definitely not getting a phone call. Or somebody sends them an email that they have to work on urgently. In the middle of the process, is thinking, oh, now I'll get back to that. I'll go open that issue later today, and then they forget. And now you've lost tracking that issue. So you want the automation internally, and certainly I know the MetricStream's done that. I've used it. They're doing it with Audit Manager now, and so there's that. Well, I'm going to talk about Audit Manager, so that's now you're talking about your external automation. So what I wanted to do is look at how do we build connections with other tools that are in the system. So the easy one was the one that I was talking about, where we had an infrastructure compliance tool running. It was similar to what Audit Manager does, AWS Audit Manager does, and it's running against particular environments, and it's telling you if you're effective with your controls, yes or no, or if it's in place or not, and then bringing that back into your tool. So that's the automation externally. So this is kind of what it looks like. And I know it's kind of crazy thing. I don't get overwhelmed with all the boxes, but what you're looking at is how do we bring in, if you think about this middle part as your platform, we also can do it, so you can do this with your GRC platform, but we also do it where we're bringing it into the engine that we built as well. So you can do it either one. What you want to do is basically, though, it's important that you're bringing information together. And that's one of the things that we've been doing, is working on how all those bits and pieces that are all over your environment, how are they talking to each other to create information and intelligence? You have a lot of information out there. We have a wealth of information out there, but we're not using it. So we want to look at, and this is what we built, and so we're bringing in things like, top left corner is contracts databases. How many times are you looking at what your contracts are looking at? I mean, are you looking at that? And so one of the things you want to think about is, what are our requirements of our contracts? What's the importance of that? Our score does that, but you want to be looking at it just in general of, you're looking at, a customer is doing an audit, let's say, of you, and they want something, and you don't provide that. Well, the first thing I want to look at is, I want to look at my contract on that. So, am I obligated to do that? Did you buy that from us? Did you purchase that from us? Did you, and this, I'm talking more than GRC, not just as Mercury, but when you're working with as a GRC, when you're working with your customer base on that, do I have a regulatory requirement to do that? If not, is that really an issue for me and my team, or are you really kind of doing a vendor risk assessment, and that's your risk to own as a customer, right? So you want to look at those kinds of things, but we don't often look at that. So we want to be able to feed information in. We've got our contracts, and we've got, if you have an asset management system, you want to feed that in. Where are your assets coming from? What are your systems? We want to look at information coming in from your architectural review board and your governance structures, and where is this information coming in? You may have findings or things that are not compliant that you should be tracking, so you want to bring that automation in. The next thing we're looking at, this yellow box, is your regs, your control frameworks and your regs. You can do that through automation. You can do like a UPS kind of integration, or you can do that with manual. So some of these things are automated, some can be manual. And then we're looking at things like, what do we have contributing groups? So are you working in isolation as your GRC? Are you working with other teams? Are you working with your legal team? Probably the answer to that is yes. But are you also working with your delivery teams? Or are you just directing everything? So you're working collaboratively with them. And then you bring all this information. You're thinking about like your asset management, your enterprise asset. We have this called Atom. The policy, your compliance, your audit, your issues management, risk management, third-party vendor risk management, all this information in there together. And this is what's going to create your actual profile. And then externally is how do we feed that information out to give some kind of intelligence and results. So you're combining all that together, and you're getting into what your scenarios are, not based on individual aspects, but the information together. So what does it look like when you're bringing all of that information together and creating a story that you can speak to, so not just one part or the other. Right now, I think you want to go into the demo.
I said to her, don't go on stage with kids or computers or me. Grace said she used to be a clinical social worker, and then she started working with me and still is. So this is just to give you a kind of quick view, if you like, of what this could, well, this actually does look like this, but just to kind of visualize what it could deliver for yourselves. And basically, again, it's why we started the conversations there on establishing those foundations. That when we start looking at value protection, as opposed to exclusively looking at loss avoidance, then we're able to do all the things that Pete and Grace were just talking about, of bringing all of that data together wherever we can and contextualizing it. So what you see here, just ignore the 60K and the 21.72K, because that's not a financial number, that's the scores that we were talking about earlier. So really the way to interpret this is, this box here is essentially the total assets. So in this particular model, we're saying there are 16 assets. So this could be 16 products that generate revenue, and or 16, or of that 16, it could be intellectual property, or so in fact we've given some examples there, source code, information, software, intellectual property, I think was the bottom one there. But also you can create the families, if you like, or the grouping of your assets, however your company operates. But what this is showing there on the left-hand side is, of those key assets, those the main assets, those things of value, it's showing us the distribution of the risks associated with each of those. Then the next donut, I guess, is talking about the total asset value risk score. So again, the reminder of that mission criticality, business importance, strategic directionality, revenue if it's revenue generating, spend if it's a third party, regulatory exposure, architectural exposure, all those kind of characteristics are what go into this asset value risk score. So again, we can see the distribution, which is really what this chart is showing us here, is the distribution of where our key risk areas, how they're distributed in terms of value, as in the value that is at risk, or the potential consequences, for example. And then finally, this one on the right-hand side is showing us of all of those addressable risk elements, so whether we're measuring vulnerabilities, the effectiveness of vulnerability management, or aged-out technology, misconfigurations, configuration drift, all those kind of, we call them addressable things that you could choose to do something about. Each one of those, the more ineffective those controls are, the more points are going to be added. And so you can see here what the distribution is as to, in terms of our addressable risk, what does that distribution look like? So really, if you kind of, first thing in the morning, your coffee, your tea, your juice, whatever it might be, what we'd like to do is just kind of see what would this tell you first thing in the morning about your priorities for the day, for the week, and for the month. So we mentioned earlier about the fact that the higher the asset value risk score, then the lower we want the target to be for that addressable risk score. So we want to be more aggressive, if you like, and say, hey, Gavin, your products are worth this much, so you can have a target of 20 points. Grace is much more valuable, so Grace, you've got a target of 10 points. And so that's literally how we're setting the risk appetite. The higher the value, the higher the exposure, then the more stringent we want to be on our controls being effective. And so you can see the typical kind of bubble distribution. So with this one, for example, the bigger the bubble, the more important the asset is. The higher it is in terms of the addressable risk score, the more problematic it is, the number of issues that it has, or the number of controls that are ineffective. So with that in mind, maybe just put it out as a question. So if you were looking just at this bubble chart here, the bigger the bubble, the more valuable the assets. The more red and the higher it is on the chart, the more problems and issues and misconfigurations and what would your decision be? Just looking at this chart on the right hand side, where would you've got a finite number of resources. Where would you get your team to focus? Or what project would you kick off? We did take a workshop, so this is now you have to work. Sorry about that?
The bigger red circle.
So the bigger red circle, does everyone agree with that? And that would make sense, right? Because we know, yes, we've got this outlier up here, but it's a smaller risk value. So do we care about it? Well, of course we do. We care about anything that's red. But we would probably and rightly be graduating towards this one, saying, well, what on earth is going on here? What's wrong with this? And so we can see it's telling us the product name. This is obviously demo data, so product 01. But we can see that of the finite resources that we have, we don't want to distract the whole organization. We can't even afford to distract the whole organization with looking at everything that's in the red. And isn't that the problems and the challenges that we face today? You know, this week it's like, oh, so how many vulnerabilities do you have? Well, criticals or heights? Well, yeah, just criticals. 10,000. Is that good? Right, so that's kind of how we try to manage IT and tech this today. Whereas what this is doing is saying, of all of the things we consider, which vulnerability management would be one of those, this one's in the biggest trouble. So we can literally, we haven't even taken our first sip out of the coffee cup, by the way. And we've already figured out, okay, we need to put some attention to this. Grace, you want to talk about these next two?
Yeah. All right, so we talked about the model together, and hopefully this is going to help you to see a little bit better. Can you see that? Can you All right, let's look at just one. So if we're looking at this, the gold bars, the bar chart, the gold bars are going to be our products. They're going to be our assets, and they're going to be the asset value risk score. The black line is going to be our target for each one of those assets, and the silvery gray line is the actual addressable risk score. So again, I'm going to challenge you on this one. Now we're combining how those elements come together. So we talked about them individually, but this one is sort of our story, right? So how does this come together? How do you action that? So if I showed you that during your morning coffee, where do you think you're going to focus?
One.
So you're saying you're going to focus on product one. Okay. Why?
The risk score is well above the target. And
I need a pointer.
yeah, you get a laser, you can blind people.
Oh, it does. Okay. So my risk score is here. My target's here. You're right there, by the way. And my asset value is way up here. So I know this is one of my higher value assets. So that's the first clue. Now, have that risk score been under the black line and say, okay, great job, whoever's running product one. We get a high value product, a high value asset, rather, high product product, and if it was under the black, you're working within risk, your threshold, you're not here. So I definitely, for me, that's the first one I'm going to go at. However, what do I go at next? So we saw that on the other bubble. This is the same data, by the way, so this is all the same together. Remember we saw that bubble that was up in the top right corner? That's this one here. Right? So it's a lower asset value. It's way above on its tolerance, right? So it's way outside the scale, but it's a lower asset. And first thing I'm going to do here, I'm not going to ignore this. I'm probably going to dive deeper into what's going on there. Because if that is an area that could then be an egress into the rest of my environment, I'm going to want to deal with that, even though it's a lower value asset. If it's the cafeteria menu, we like to use that one as an example. This is the cafeteria menu, and we've got something here, and it's segregated enough for the rest of my environment, I'm not going to worry about that. Unless I've got a different team that can spend the cycles doing that, but if I've got a finite amount of time, which typically we do, I'm going to put this on the back burner for now.
But if it's the cafeteria up here, but was negatively impacted. Why would we, like, when you assign that?
So here's the value. The value's down here. The value's that little, the gold bar. So the value is low, but it's doing something naughty. Like it's just not having, the controls are not in place there. And so we might still we want to track that because depending on how you're segmented and how you're, so the cafeteria menu may or may not be even showing up. It may never show up. Maybe something else with lower value. Maybe it's a product here that you're about to end of life. So when we bring all that scoring together, it's going to have a low value because the mission criticality is going to be lower. Maybe even the business impact is low because maybe now it's something about end of life, about to end of life. You've migrated almost all of your customers off that product. They're in some other environment. Maybe they're in product one. So the value is low. Again, though, so let's use that as an example. If this is a product I'm about to end of life, I'm going to still want to look at, I'm not going to ignore that. I am going to look at what those are. I may or may not put my resources and prioritize that, but I'm going to look at what's going on there because, again, if that's, so let's say it is in your environment, it's a product about to end of life, and what are those security controls, or what are those controls that are not in place that are causing this score to be high? If there's something just impacting that environment or that product, and it's not going to cause a risk somewhere else, then I might just ignore it.
Why don't you just take your asset value score and take the variance between the target and the actual addressable risk score?
I'm sorry, what?
Why don't you just take your asset value risk score, okay, and take the variance or the difference between your addressable risk target versus the addressable risk score, and then kind of mathematically try to.
And we do. And so we have another slide. I don't know if we have it on this PowerPoint for us today, but we do also look at the percentage you're within threshold. So we have a calculation that we look at the difference, and so that's a good point, is where is your target and how are you trending towards your drift, or either positive or negative on related to the threshold. As we do that as a percentage, because again, your different assets have different values. And so we will do that as a percentage. I don't know if we have that here, do we?
Is that also like subtracting addressable risk score from the asset value risk score?
No, it's not a subtraction, but just to answer your question, we're not out on this deck, but we have two things. So what Grace was just describing is the performance, the performance of that particular product from a risk perspective. The principles that apply to this are exactly the same way you would do financial management. So if I've got a budget of $1 million a quarter, or I should have used 999 a quarter, it's easy to divide by 3. I might exceed my budget by 5% in month 1. I might come in under my budget by 5% in month 2, and so I need to make sure I hit my budget in month 3. So my performance of my financial management is done the way you described it in percentage. So by what percentage am I either under or over budget? So we apply the same principle between here the black line and the silver line. So we do have a sense of what's your performance rate for that particular product or for a risk owner. Your second question is essentially the relationship. I think, Mike, this is where you were going with your question about subtraction. The relationship between the risk performance and the value of the asset. So we do have that kind of view as well. What's really cool with the model is as we pull in all these data sources, everything that we're representing here, it's like probably a portfolio of like 10 different views. But if you're using something like Power BI or QuickSight or anything like that, you can create all kinds of different sets and views from that same data set to get, for example, the kind of question that you're asking, what is the relationship between risk management performance and the actual value of the asset? So, yeah, a long way of saying yes.
Question, and pardon me if I missed it, I stepped up for a minute. The addressable risk targets, is that a derivative of the asset value risk score, or does the manager determine their target?
So the addressable risk score, so they are two different scores, and they're calculated on their own. So the asset value risk score is going to be from all of the elements that are feeding in. So it's your mission criticality, business impact, your financial, your architectural, your regulatory scrutiny. That's going to give you one score. The addressable risk score, when I was talking about automation, I should have mentioned this, and I'm glad you brought that up actually. The automation that we're doing, a lot of that, we're bringing that in order to create their addressable risk score. So your addressable risk score is actually being derived from all of the effectiveness and the controls that you have, and bringing all of that together. So we normalize all of those different elements. We've got things coming in from vulnerabilities, and that's going to be a, 1 to, well, not a 1, but it's going to be a 1,000 to 100,000. And then you've got information on your issues or your audits and ISCO, or we have things like aging. So if an audit is aged, so let's say you had your SOC audit last July. So it's an 11-month-old audit. Well, if you haven't done anything internally to be assessing those, how much can you rely on that report? So the aging of a report, we also give points to that if it's an older. So there's a difference in our scoring. I want to be very clear. There's a difference between compliance and risk. And so our scores are based on how reliable is that information, how old is that information, how accurate is the information, what the numbers are, the empirical numbers of your different compliance. So that's not. So you might be well within compliance. You would be well within compliance, right? If you have an 11-month-old audit and the auditor is coming back out in July, great, so you're fine from a compliance perspective. But if you're relying on that information, and some of your customers even might even say, well, that's an old audit, so are you still there, or have you drifted? So that, we can do that through either automation or manual import of information. But then what we're doing is, Oh, I was saying, so then what we're doing is that we're bringing those two scores together and how they relate to each other.
Right.
So they're not mathematically scoring against each other, with the exception of creating the target.
So I'm sorry if I said,
yeah,
I was asking about the.
So he's the genius in the math on that one. I'm gonna let him explain the math on the target, but the target is a creation of those two things.
Sorry, I didn't mean to briefly. One reason why I pulled this part of this section up here, this is really the answer to your question. So, a lot of customers work on like a tiered-based system. So, like, is it a tier 1 product, or I'm using product as an example, and I said it could be a process or whatever. Is it a tier 1 or a tier 2 or tier 3? We have other customers that I think the most we've ever encountered is they have a 10-tier system. So what we're showing you on the screen here is like in the 3. This is just for the purpose of the demo. If they're basically using a 3-tier system, so it's either a tier 1 asset, a tier 2 asset, or a tier 3 asset. You can see over here on the right, then the targets are set based on the tiering, and the tiering is derived from the asset value risk score. So it's nothing that's like hard coded in there. The other thing we talked about at the end, we'll talk about some keys to success, and that is one of the keys to success actually, is that within the system you can set your target score, if you like, for what do we think is an acceptable score, what do we think is tolerable, because we have change freezes at certain times and there's things we just can't fix in a heartbeat, and then what's the score that says that is completely unacceptable. And that's really what these 3 are: appetite, tolerance, and threshold. Threshold, if you exceed the threshold, that's not acceptable. Tolerance is okay, and then you get to decide for how long. So, for example, if you are using like MetricStream, for example, it's your GRC platform, you could set a rule that says, if we have any asset that is beyond its threshold for more than a period of X hours, days, or weeks, to automatically create an entry in your risk register, or to automatically create an issue in your GRC system. We are already pulling in, for example, from MetricStream for the actual issues as well, and mapping them using that add-in that we talked about earlier. So again, a long answer to your question, but this is where we set those targets. One of the keys to success is that if you're part of the office of the CISO, or if you're part of your COO office, what we've always encouraged is build a governing body around setting these targets that involves different, so you've got business representation, you've got delivery represented, or you've got dev represented. Because if we don't do that, then we will have people arguing with the score and say, well, that's your numbers. Whereas we actually recommend that do that, say, at least the quarterly thing is to revisit these targets across the multiple groups. And then that way people are accepting the message, if you like.
We're looking at 20 minutes.
Did you actually want to this as well?
Oh, okay, yeah. So this one, what we're looking at is, so when we look at the model that we have here, the other thing that happens is, here's what are my top risks? And so what we want to be able to do is to be able to show, we talked about the likelihood of these things being impacted, or the risk being actualized, is the less effective your controls and the less secure your environment is because of the lack of controls, the more likely that you're going to have a problem. And that's kind of common sense. What we're doing here is we're looking at the addressable elements and which ones are ranking the highest. And you can see on this, for example, this one here is, I think this is the server vulnerability that got cut off, but that's saying high server vulnerabilities in the production environment. And what we're doing is we're looking at these. You can't see this here, but I think you can do this, right? Yeah, if I have on there, it's going to tell you which product or which asset is contributing to your score. And so you can see that, like this one here, is you've got product A2 has a high, it is the production server vulnerabilities, has the highest amount contributing to that. So if you want to look at where your control effectiveness is and looking at the different elements that are contributing to it, then we can break it down and say, okay, well, who's going to go, how do you address that? How do you set the priorities of where do I go? Well, I can look at this very easily. So well, product A2 is contributing to that, and I know that O1 has the second highest amount, and then we're going to go to the service foundation, who's the third in this demo environment. So you can look at these and then relative to each other. You'll see though that on this model, the way that we've done it is typically you're going to see these vulnerabilities. I mean, we would expect, a lot of times you're going to expect the vulnerabilities, if you've got a highly vulnerable environment where you've got a lot of vulnerabilities that are open, they're going to rise. Definitely, I mean, vulnerabilities are definitely going to be one of your top 10. However, what you don't often see is that we've got things in here like with your ISO audit. So the way that this model is working in the test environment that we have here, the demo environment, a lot of things, so you were asking earlier, someone was asking earlier about the stack ranking and the relativity of different elements to each other. If you've got an element, if you've got a product rather, or an asset that is, that has, that a number of things, or a number of these products are going together into your ISO. Let's say you're doing an enterprise-wide ISO audit, and all of your products are being audited. Well, if you've got a control deficiency in a particular area, or you have an audit finding, so let's say this is an ISO audit finding, you've got an audit finding that's going against a lot of your assets, it's going to show up as multiple times over. It's not going to show up just once, it'll show up for each one of those assets. And so we do have that concept of things affecting multiple things. It can affect enterprise-wide. So let's say it's something like, I don't know, training. And so you get, an issue with your onboarding training or something. That's going to affect that might affect your ISO audit. Well, that's going to affect the ISO audit for every one of those products that's going through the audit. That's in scope for that audit. So we've got things in here that I think most of us in this room, if you're coming from a GRC perspective, most of us understand the importance of that, but I don't think our delivery teams always understand the importance of having things that are not just technical controls that could impact our audits, for example, and the impact that has. And so how we look at how we need to do some work to firm those up as well. Any additional to that?
Yeah, perhaps the other thing that you talked earlier about scenarios and how many questions, sorry?
So could you just zoom out?
Yeah.
Looking at that chart and then one of the circles, using this dashboard, could I identify, let's say I'm resolving the big circle.
Yeah.
By resolving that, would it demonstrate how much risk reduction there is in the other circles?
Yeah, so the question was,
like say like
yes.
If I resolve this, how much?
Right, like just say MFA across a single sign.
So if you think kind of answer the question, the question rather was, if you're focusing on, I'm just trying to get that out. If you're focusing on one of these big circles, is there a way you can model it to say, okay, so if I go and solve problem number one, what does that, what would the impact would be? Yes, there's a graphic for that, but I'll show you a slightly different view of the machine goes. So I can look at addressable risk score, for example. BRT is not B right there. It's beyond risk threshold. So if we wanted to look at, let's say, well, this is a big number, right? So that would product A2, that was the big, well, not a big circle, but it was the big addressable number. But if I click on that just as an example, once the data loads, what you're going to see is, first of all, I have to point this out because, you know, this is Grace's little baby. The thermometer on the right-hand side. So it's a play on mercury. You know, mercury, we've really got its speed, but like the original thermometers used to be mercury-based, the manometers mercury-based. So this is your temperature. So you can say you've got a raging fever on this product or on this asset. But to your point there, well, we can look then straight away. We can see what's contributing, and so these are all then stacked ranked. So we can say, well, what is contributing to that? So we can see we've basically got, you know, 82, nearly 83,000 risk points because of high vulnerabilities in the production environment. So then you can say, okay, now in this view, you don't do the modeling. We do have a module that does the modeling, but you can literally do what-if scenarios. Right? And that does tie back nicely to that other graph, because when Grace showed it on the actual control types, it was vulnerabilities in the production environment that was the biggest contributor. So therefore, you've got a root cause. So now you can deal with a root cause that's affecting more than one product. So like, okay, so what would that do if we were to cut in half the number of high vulnerabilities in the production environment? What would that do to every risk score for every product that's impacted? Now again, just as a reminder that the vulnerabilities, when we pull them in, is mapped to the products, or to the assets, I should say. So it's not just randomly saying, hey, we've got 10,000 high production vulnerabilities, what should we do? You know, with this model, you can say which ones you care about the most. So you can actually say it's that vulnerability and that vulnerability because it's on that container or in that virtual machine because it's affecting these particular products. So that's really one of the kind of real beauties of it, if you like, is that you can make those contextualized prioritization decisions. So, you know, really the power of this is not doing risk quantification for the risk quantification's sake. What it's really doing is actually giving that decision-making capability and pretty quickly.
So one other thing on that, when you're looking at you started saying on scenarios. So when we were talking earlier, we were saying we don't really love that annual scenario risk assessment that you do where you sit around the table. What we are working on now with our customers is taking this data, so we're looking at like maybe this one here, this top 10 scores, using those as the foundation, because there is a value in doing threat modeling. So I look at that, I don't like to call that thing a risk assessment. I know the auditors do, but I don't like to. But I like to look at it as scenario-based threat modeling. But rather than sitting around and say, okay, what are our top threats this year? What are we going to do a scenario, when do we do a workshop on or do some threat modeling on? We take the data and we'll say, okay, these are the areas that we're failing in the most. And these are the products that we're doing it on. And now let's do threat modeling on these actual environments and say, okay, what do we think, how do we envision that things will happen? We're still data driving it, and I don't think that, I mean, I would love to just get away from that altogether. I don't think as an industry we're there yet. I think our technical teams like that, they feel comfortable with that. They feel comfortable even sometimes with the critical, high, medium, low scoring. So what we actually do is, on one of our other dashboards, is we will convert that in threshold, as we saw the red, the in threshold, beyond threshold, or within tolerance, which is a yellow, so it's you're above your appetite, but below your threshold. And so within tolerance, but kind of still, you want to be looking at that. We convert all of that also into red, amber, green, and critical, high, medium, low. if your team is more comfortable with that, because I find that some of our staff, that if they've not been involved with quantitative scoring, they feel more comfortable in that. It's just the area that they're more familiar with, but we're data driving it. So we take some of that argument, the speculation, and the subjectivity out of it, so that there isn't that debate of, well, I think it's critical, no, I think it's medium. It's, what is your data set? Yeah? Going on to the next slide. We're just about 2 minutes. All right, so what are some of our keys to success? Well, Gavin talked a little bit about it. So we're looking at GRC, and I know, like most of you said earlier, and that's been my background is, typically we have, the areas that we have of common challenges are financial resource constrictions. I don't know about the rest of you. My experience is that security, while everyone talks about how security is the top thing, we're still not getting the largest budget. We're getting a decent budget, and we're definitely growing as an industry than we were 10 years ago, but we're still not getting the budget we want. For me, and I typically sat in the office of the CISO or information security or something, some group like that. So I'm competing now with my peers that are running vulnerability management and the various different, APT stuff and the different types of, the logical access systems. So I'm competing in budget with them for my GRC. So I need to be able to do stuff more efficiently and more effectively with the same number of resources and typically around the same number of dollars. I don't get a lot allocated to me from a GRC perspective in that realm. So I need to be able to do things effectively. So that's one of the challenges I get. Equally, my company, in general, the company, when I'm working GRC, the company I'm working for, well, we've got a limited number of resources. And so when I've got an engineering team, they're building a product, well, their time is focused on building the product to the next version. But I need them from a GRC or a compliance perspective. I also need them thinking about it from a compliance perspective and how we're securing up our environment. Well, every time that I pull them away to go resolve an audit or to participate in an audit for that matter, I'm pulling them away from time that they're spending doing new features. So we compete with that. So we've got competing priorities. Oftentimes what I'll hear people say is, in my career, I've never had anybody say to me, and if I say something like, well, I need you to go fix those vulnerabilities, or I need you to go do some patching, or get high numbers there. I've never had anybody say to me, that's the stupidest thing ever, I have no desire to do that, I'm not doing it. What I hear them saying is, I know I got those things I gotta go resolve, or I got that open audit issue that I gotta resolve. Yeah, I know today was my day, but a client called, and we got this escalation, and I gotta go deal with that, but I'll get to that tomorrow. And then tomorrow becomes tomorrow, and I'm chasing them now. I've got an open audit issue, I've got auditors coming, and I'm chasing them. So one of the things around that automation that I talked about is where we can help them to reduce the manual efforts that they are when they're working with us from a GRC perspective. That's one of our keys to success. The competing priorities, resources priorities, the complex regulations, they're constantly changing, and they're getting more and more complex. So we're teaching our teams how to be compliant, and then it changes. And that's great. I mean, it's always part of our progress, but it's keeping up with all of those things. So again, the more that we can have automation doing some of this, the testing, the evidence collection, the bringing information together, the more we can do that through automation, the less people time, the less human errors we're going to have. We can scale better. When we're doing manual processes, there are going to be a limited number. I was talking to you earlier about when I did that modularized program. We did it based on, I had the key controls, and we did a small number of those. I did about 25 to 30 customers per region. So we had 3 regions, that's 75. I told you we had 5,000 customers at the time. There was no way I was going to do anything from a compliance perspective with a manual process, and they just couldn't give me the time. I didn't have their resources, I didn't have their priorities. So doing things through automation and bringing that information together through automation, I was able to scale that. So rather than testing 75 to 100 environments a year, or customers a year, I was able, because I had that automation running in that infrastructure compliance, I was able to do that on we had about at that time, we had about 500,000 servers. We were running compliance, infrastructure compliance on about half of that, about 250,000. I was able to get information on 250,000 of our environments every month, and we were growing that. So the goal was to get the infrastructure compliance tooling into more environments, then we could scale. And then I've talked a lot about the automation. The other thing that's important here is that, yeah, I talked a little bit, is we talk in our model, and then just in my word to advice from a GRC perspective is partner with your stakeholders. If your team is directing the rest of the company on how they have to do things, and I've had that happen. One of the companies I worked with, I had a person on the GRC team that was responsible for writing all the policies. Well, that's great, but that meant first of all, he couldn't possibly know how everybody was doing everything and how to operationalize it in the company for every department, right? So there's a bit of almost arrogance in that you have all that information, you're the only person that knows that. The other thing without partnering with stakeholders in that is that they have a buy-in. So when you're partnering with your stakeholders for anything around the GRC, but then also with this model around our scoring, around our coefficients and how we're stack ranking things, the relative importance, when you're bringing that together and you're partnering with your stakeholders, then they have a buy-in on it. And they participate in it. The more they participate in it, the more they're gonna want to use the method. And the more they'll believe the score. So, we've talked about it a couple of times where people have said, well, your numbers, I like this method, but your numbers are making me look bad. Well, your numbers are not making me look bad. Your lack of attention to the whatever, vulnerabilities or your issues or whatever is bringing in your score to the architectural design, your lack of attention on that is what's making your score, because it's all data driven. We're not going to argue with it. And then the other thing is that I always talk to my teams when I'm running GRC, I always talk to my teams about the fact that we are a role of influence. The same idea. I don't want to be that yes, no button, that Staples button. It's like, well, I don't think it's yes, no, but whatever it was, that Staples button. I don't want my team to be a yes, no. I want them to partner with people, and then I want them to be a role of influence. Why is it important to your stakeholder? How do you appeal to them? Not because it's an audit, not because the auditor is coming in. If the only reason your team does something, your delivery teams, your IT teams, your OT teams, the only reason they're doing something is because of the audit, you don't have a good environment. You don't have a sound foundation of, we want to do the best thing that's right for our company, because presumably you're also doing this for the data and the information for your own company, as well as your customers. You should be doing it because it's the right thing to do. The audit should be verifying that. So you want to partner with, why is this important? When I'm looking at the risks, I'm looking at the priorities and the way that we're stack ranking that, when we bring that information together, I can show them why this is important. I can say, well, we've got this massive number here for addressable risk. And this is one of the most important, your asset value risk is very high here. When you combine those together, you've got a high value asset and low effectiveness of your controls. Then I can appeal to them of, you're putting your product at risk because you don't have the effectiveness in there. Or conversely, I can say, you got a high value asset and good job, Bob. Your number is below your target. You're doing a great job securing up your environment. And then I can show it to them with data versus just saying, I think we're doing a good job. And then the other thing I always like to use, and I have it here, but we've said it repeatedly, is we're using data. Just make sure you're using your data. And what's next?
All right, so I guess just a quick summary of kind of key takeaways. So mentioned earlier, right, you start with what you do know, improve based on what you could know, and aspire to what you should know. And what we've certainly found is that sometimes when people get stuck, it's like, well, I don't even know where to start. And then they're trying to go to the aspirational level straight away. As I mentioned earlier, this is not the Texas accent. It used to be about 250 years ago, I think, something like that, but not anymore. So my family are from a place in Ireland called Limerick, which we're familiar with. And then, somebody would ask her for directions. And would stop in the street and ask her where's the to St. Mary's Park or whatever. And she'd just say, well, I wouldn't start from here if I were you. And then she'd pause, and then the person would look for something, and then she'd laugh. And I wasn't sure if that was like, I think it's just like a normal thing to say, well, don't start from here, you'll never get there. But the reality is, there's only one place we can start, and that's right where we are. In fact, we do say stupid things, but you've got to start somewhere. Yes. Yeah. So when you think about it, you know, we all as organizations, we all have data. You know, whether it's coming out from an open source vulnerability scan, whether it's coming out of Tenable, whether it's coming out of Jira, whether it's coming out of MetricStream, wherever it's coming from, we as organizations have got the data. And so I use these graphics, by the way, quite deliberately. So it's not just saying, hey, look at these firefighters, aren't they brave? The message there in that picture is, with a lack of clarity, with a lack of clear vision, there is danger. So we're surrounded by all this data, essentially, but we don't have clarity on it, or particularly we don't. So this kind of methodical quantification approach gives us that clear view. The other one is motorcycle racing, again, on purpose. That's my brother, Darren. It's the longer story. I'll tell you all the drinks in a few minutes. Long story short, he got into a terrible bike accident, almost died. He's still alive and he still races. And when we think about controls, he could have reduced his speed, and that would have changed the likelihood. So that control would change the likelihood of having the accident in the first place. But even if he still had the accident with no crash helmet on, the consequence was going to be the same. So, however, when he's on a race circuit, when he does have a crash helmet on, that slowing down increases the likelihood of losing the race. So, you know, something we can talk about another time, or drinks later, or whatever, is really when it comes to risk management, we talked about earlier about optimization, because what we're really doing is a risk exchange. We can change the likelihood, and we can exchange one consequence for either a similar consequence or a different consequence or multiple consequences. But again, that's where quantification helps us. In every other business domain, by the way, we look for a return on risk, not a reduction on risk or of risk. So again, that's where quantification to optimize what risk should we take, those vulnerabilities, which ones should we just ignore, and which ones can we afford to ignore, versus which ones do we need to plow attention to, for example. And then the final one, I took that one morning when I was just chilling, nice weather, and it's really, just start where we are. Start with what you do now. And that's it, I think. Oh, Winston Churchill, what about that? Perfection is the enemy of progress. So, you know, and Grace often says, quantifying something is better than quantifying nothing. So just start with what we do now, and aspire to what we should do. Thank you all, we'll be around. If anybody solve your question.